What inspired me to pick my field of study was learning the differences between uracil and cytosine. Those are nucleotides in our cells. Cytosine is found in our DNA, whereas uracil is found in RNA. And there was this one chemical modification between the two, a methyl group between the two nucleosides. And the reason why our cells spend energy to make this modification is so that when there are errors in our cells, it can be caught in DNA, whereas it can't be caught in RNA. And so when I found that out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Our cells do this chemistry, and they learned about this. And what's even more fascinating is this chemistry that our cells do, our immune system also intentionally does this chemistry as well for B-cell immunity, to generate more and more mutations to make more diverse cells. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so fascinated. I need to know more about this. At the time, it didn't feel like advice. It felt more like an insult. But one time I was complaining to one of my friends about how difficult it was to be a double major, because we have extra lab requirements, and it was just no time to do everything. And so, I spent a good 30 minutes complaining about how hard my life was as an undergraduate. And then he said, you just wasted 30 minutes of your time complaining. And so initially I was like, oh, I can't believe he said that. But then, it really got to me that I should work, instead of complaining, I should just try and work. It could be harder or it could be easier. And so that really got me going on a work ethic. And so where I learned about the differences between RNA and DNA was in a bioorganic class. And it was my favorite because it was where we got to use organic chemistry, but it wasn't as hard as organic chemistry. You didn't have to know all of those mechanisms, only the ones that pertain to a bio context. And so that's where we learned about the energy and the differences, and cytosine being hydrolyzed to uracil, etc. And that really inspired me to pursue further graduate study in bioorganic and biochemistry. Well, okay, so you don't really realize this from the day-to-day operation of being a graduate student, especially when you're with a bunch of chemists, but wearing the lab coat and the goggles and the gloves, dressing up like a scientist and doing chemistry it's really exciting. I mean, sometimes it's not, it's rigorous data crunching and things like that, but I mean, you look like a scientist, and so you're like, wow, I have all these test tubes and little reaction flasks everywhere, and so my lab actually looks like I'm doing chemistry. Researchers, in order to have data, they need to have a huge work ethic, because we have to go day in and day out, and when we do something incorrectly, we can't just pass it aside. We have to redo it, and that requires an incredible amount of patience. And then the second thing that I think researchers really need is knowing how to communicate. So it's so easy to talk about your research to a coworker who understands what you're doing, but to talk to a broader audience is so difficult because you want to be correct. You want to be as rigorous and as accurate as you can be. But when you move to metaphors and analogies, it starts to become a little blurry. And but if you don't use metaphors and analogies, then you can't really explain your work to people. It just goes over their head, or they get lost in the scientific jargon. And so I think that's a really valuable trait to have as a researcher. I think the benefits of my research elucidating the mechanism of nitrogenase has two benefits. One, it's such a complex and fascinating enzyme. It does really interesting chemistry on its own. It has 3 unique metaclusters. So if we were to learn how it worked, just from a chemistry standpoint, we could learn novel mechanisms, or it could help with new inorganic catalysts, or we can just learn basic science from studying this enzyme. A second incentive for studying it would be it could provide insight into making new catalysts for the Haber-Bosch process. And since it does it at such ideal and optimum conditions compared to the industrial process, it could really help reduce the cost of producing ammonia, which happens to be one of the most produced chemicals worldwide. Would it be weird to say that I think my students have had a huge impact on me in terms of being a researcher and an educator? Because I think a lot of research is education, but a lot of people don't think of it that way. I've had a lot of opportunities to teach students, and I think that's where the fascination and enthusiasm for science comes from. I remember this one time in OChem lab, something was not going right in lab. But you know, it's fine. We actually did science, and so when we found out what went wrong with the lab and we made a conclusion based on a hypothesis, I literally jumped for joy and was like, guys, this is science, this is research, and they were actually excited. It was awesome. And so I think when I work with students, it's motivating because the more we learn, the more we can teach. I mean, assuming that my iPhone wasn't in my pocket, it would be my iPhone. I love Death Cab for Cutie, Snow Patrol, Passion Pit,